This lesson is Entre Deux, which in the French means between two. And you can see here, it's a way of joining two separate fabrics with somewhat of an embroidery stitch. The stitches I'm going to show you here really are based on a blanket stitch. So the first order of business is to demonstrate the blanket stitch. Then we will look at how to create these 3 stitches. Before I demonstrate the Entre Deux, I want to demonstrate the blanket stitch, as 2 of the 3 stitches in the Entre Deux depend on that particular stitch. I have a folded edge here, and you could use this really on any folded edge. I'm actually using the Mara 30 because a heavier thread looks well when you're sewing this. So to begin, you come out, and then the stitch itself sews like this. And you can see the thread passes behind the needle and you pull perpendicular thread passes behind the needle. It's perpendicular to the folded edge. You pull everything straight out and you just continue sewing that way. Having a shorter thread is going to help you manage all of this. So that is what it looks like. That is the basic stitch. I'm just going to sew a couple more just so you have that in your mind. And the depth of the stitch is really up to you. Ideally, the needle should enter the fabric parallel, but since I'm filming this and looking through the camera, it's kind of hard to do. The final stitch, the last stitch you sew with the blanket stitch, you can just come in here, barely catch the edge of the thread, secure it, and you would bury the needle and the end of the thread in the fold here. So a little bit janky, but this is the stitch we're going to be using for the Entre Deux. When you're working with Entre Deux, you want to have 2 folded edges. And really what I've done is I've just folded this back, put a little fusible web on it. You could machine stitch it, whatever. You have 2 folded edges, and then you stitch them to a piece of paper which holds them parallel to each other. This paper gets removed once everything is sewn, but you need to stabilize everything while you're working so that you will have 2 edges that will run parallel to each other once you're finished. This is stitch number 1. To begin, use again your Mara 30, knot the thread, and I like to bring the first stitch up so that the knot is on the back side. And then, again, thinking blanket stitch, you stitch into the fabric and make sure that the thread goes behind the needle. And you space these out. You could actually mark the stitch length if you want. The needle catches from top down, and here, maybe you can see better this way. Okay, there. So, like the blanket stitch, the thread ends up behind the needle as you're sewing. And you space the stitches evenly. And here you go. I'm going to take one more stitch and then secure it, and then show you what we have. And when you secure it, you can run the thread like so. And pull slightly. Thread end disappears between the two. Now, here. That's what it's going to look like. You want to use a strong thread on here because this is going to hold two garment sections together, so it has to be secure. So, this is our first one. This, if you sew about 3 inches, that will be sufficient for this assignment. The next stitch I call Birdie Feet. And when you see it, you'll understand why I call it Birdie Feet. But still, it is, again, the blanket stitch, just a variation. So to begin, I like to secure the thread. And then make sure the needle is behind. There's one. And then make one a little deeper. 2. And one shorter. 3. So to show you what this looks like, it looks like a little birdie foot in my mind. So we're going to continue by coming over here. Again, making sure that the thread is behind the needle when you're coming out through the fabric. And there's another birdie foot. So I'm going to work and let you watch me work. It's like watching paint dry, but there you have it. So that you can see how this works. And again, it's all spacing and accuracy. If you want to mark these little points to make sure that everything is completely spaced evenly, that is entirely up to you. I've done that, so there's no shame in marking it if you really need that as your guide. If I were marking it, I would be using the disappearing ink pens, because you can just mark little tiny dots where you need them, and then when you give this a good press, because you will, the marks will go away. So, like the other one, 3 inches of this will be plenty good for your assignment. Now I will go off camera and work the rest of this and come back here. Now I'm at the end, and this one, like the other one, you want to secure, so I will just take one little stitch right there and secure. Then bury the end of the thread between the layers. Pull that, and there you have it. So you can see what this looks like. Like I said, it reminds me of Birdie Feet. Maybe a little bit hokey, but there you have it. From here, we have one more to do. The third one I call thread bars. It again works with the Mara 30 thread, and it's a variation of the blanket stitch. So we secure the thread, and then directly across we have a thread bar. So now I'm going to zoom in a little bit and turn this. So then this is where you make the blanket stitch. Make sure that the thread goes behind the needle, and you cover this little thread bar with blanket stitch. This is rather labor intensive, but these little details are things you can really charge for. Or if you scale it up, you could do the same kind of thing using quite a lot of thicker thread. This is called Entre Deux. Like I said earlier, there's another term, a term I loathe, it's called faggoting, because I used to be called that as a child and teenager. So I don't subscribe to that particular term. I prefer to use the French, which is Entre Deux, meaning between two. And so once you have covered this, then you're going to take the needle and travel between the layers and make another thread bar directly across. And again. Work the blanket stitch to cover the thread. It's just very pretty. If you're looking for historical context here, early 1900s, a blouse was called a shirtwaist, and there was this fashion for blouses and dresses in white linen. And there was a lot of this kind of handwork on those particular blouses. This and the drawn work, which we did before. So these are the kinds of details that, if you're working on a period costume, they'd be very effective for film, not so much for stage. And again, run between the layers and emerge out. I'll show you kind of what they look like close up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off camera and work some more, and I will bring it back to you here. I'm back. So now the question would be, how do you tie off after you've sewn your last blanket stitch here, I would catch that stitch there and come through the loop to secure the thread. Then again, you would bury the thread between the two layers and trim. So you can get a good look at it. That is the thread bars. So I'm going to zoom out. So we have the 3 samples. So if you did 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches, or 1.5 inches on this, you will have fulfilled the homework. Now, I'm going to remove the thread basting so you can see what this looks like once it's done. Here we have the Entre Deux removed from the paper. So you get a little sense of how charming that could be. So you could see skin between these 2 edges. It gives a little range of motion, but not much. And so that, dear class, is the Entre Deux lesson.